Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here in the direction of the north of Avdiivka. North of Ocheretine, the Russians have made this advance west of Nevelske, where the Russians are now moving in a northern direction through the main road, pushing through the Ukrainian fortifications in the area and forest lines to push on to the high ground location elevated positions of the Ukrainian fortifications north of these villages. This will expand the front line from the villages here by Ocheretine and upwards towards the open fields south of Kalinove. The open field south of Kalinove is filled with Ukrainian fortifications all across the forest lines. However, we see that there is a clear indication that the fortifications are pointed in a eastern direction, as we see with the fortifications here. There are forest lines and another layer of forest lines with these fortifications located in the area pointing in the eastern direction, as well as the southern direction here by the heights towards Arkhangelsk, where the Ukrainians are defending in a southern direction. From the western direction, there are no clear fortifications towards that position. This means that it is likely that the Russians will continue pushing in a northern direction to flank and hit these Ukrainian fortifications from behind. This will allow them to get rid of the biggest advantage of the Ukrainian fortifications, and that is the direction that they are pointing at. This will allow the Russians to flank the Ukrainian positions by Kalinove. However, to do that, they need to secure their flank. This means that it is likely that they'll have to capture Novo-Oleksandrivka before they can start pushing towards Kalinove. It is likely that this advance by the Russians here to the south of the river line is likely simply due to Ukrainian withdrawal and not really because of a Russian push. Otherwise, the Russian push would come from the road here to the west. Could also be an attempt by the Russians to connect the two roads from Ocheretine towards the one going all the way around from Novo-Oleksandrivka. So with this, we see that there are attempts by the Russians to possibly connect the two to make a strong push through the road towards Novo-Oleksandrivka. This would require the Russians to capture the first fortifications in the area to secure the northern flank before pushing towards Novo-Oleksandrivka. This would mean a step one would be to push here in the northern direction, gain control over these fortifications, western direction, gain control over the fortifications outside of Novo-Oleksandrivka, and hitting the town itself. The town of Novo-Oleksandrivka focuses around this long area here filled with buildings. Then we have the fortifications to the southwest and to the south of it. To the southeast, there's also this line of trenches. So with this, we see that there are three separate fortifications connected to Novo-Oleksandrivka, all pointing in the eastern and northern direction. This means that the area in which the Russians are attacking from. This means that these fortifications have their maximum output of defensive capabilities towards the Russian positions. This makes Novo-Oleksandrivka a difficult town for the Russians to capture, and this is why they didn't simply just move into it as soon as they reached it, but are preparing for a larger assault towards it, which takes time. To the south, in the direction of Solovyove, to the northwest of the village, the Russians have captured this forest line. This is likely to push towards the next Ukrainian fortifications to the east of Sokil, where the Russians would here attempt to gain control over the fortifications by the railways, which are looking in a downward and easternward position here in this direction, before pushing down south and attacking the Ukrainian fortifications by Sokil from multiple directions. With this, we see it is likely that the Russians will do a combined operation from the north and from the east to hit the Ukrainian fortifications by Sokil, and then moving onwards from there. If the Russians gain control over the fortifications, they'll gain control over the village and push on to the next two fortifications to the west, the fortifications here to the north and along the railway. This is clear that the Russians are going to be pushing through the railway to bypass the Ukrainian fortifications here that are all pointing in a southeastern position. This will allow the Russians to bypass these fortifications and avoid the direct hit of them by avoiding their line of sight. To the south of Solovyove, west of Berdishi, the Russians pushed in a western direction towards Pokrovsk. We see here the Russians are pushing through the southwest of Solovyove and west of Berdishi to hit the village of Pokrovsk before moving on to the fortifications north of Novoselivka Persha. This will be in combination with a Russian assault from Semenivka through the main road towards Novoselivka Persha. To secure the northern flank, they are looking to gain control over Novopokrovsk before moving on west of Semenivka. To the west of Orlivka, the Russians started offensive operations in the direction of Umanske towards the fortifications to the east of the village, and yet again avoiding their line of sight of the Ukrainian fortifications by hitting directly from the east rather than from the low grounds to the south. This is an area that has been largely untouched since the Russians captured the village of Orlivka and Semenivka weeks and months ago. This indicates that it is a newly started Russian offensive or an expansion of the Russian offensive west of Avdiivka towards the second and third lines of Ukrainian defenses positions here to the west of the city. In the south, the Russians have started hitting the Ukrainian pocket here to the east of Nevelske, and the Ukrainians actually managed to recapture Nevelske, as is shown with this geolocated footage, showing Ukrainian soldiers present within the eastern parts of the village, which means that the Ukrainians have managed to recapture the village of Nevelske, which is located in the high grounds in the area. This means that this is actually a significant development in favor of the Ukrainians to secure their positions within the area. The Russians will have a difficult time having their pocket closed and holding their positions here to the east of Nevelske without the control of the village itself, and the Ukrainians with their fortifications in the close proximity of the village by the main supply road has a secure supply road. This is why the Russians have started pushing through the pocket. Getting control of it would allow the Russians to then attack Nevelske and secure their positions by connecting the two sides and having a secure front line in this section of the front line. We see that Nevelske itself was a position which the Russians held on to, but they didn't really have their flanks secured. The northern, western, and southern flanks were all under Ukrainian control, and this has allowed them to recapture the village. This is why the Russians are now moving to gain control over the pocket, to gain control over the eastern, northern, and southern parts, before moving on to gain control over Nevelske and pushing in a western direction. Again, gaining control of Nevelske would allow the Russians to pressure the Ukrainian fortifications in the area, both to the north and to the south, to improve their positions of the Russians west of Donetsk city. Moving further south in the direction of Novomikhailivka, the Russians have now started an assault towards Pokrovsk, gaining a foothold within the village, and this marks the start of offensive operations west of Novomikhailivka following the capture of the town. If the Russians capture Pokrovsk, they can move further westwards towards the Dacha area connected to Konstantinivka. This will be in a separate area through the lake and river, separating the northern and southern sides. The Ukrainians have massive fortifications to the west of the road, which means that it is likely that the Russians will rather focus on the fortifications and Ukrainian positions south of Konstantinivka, similar to Novomikhailivka, where they aligned the front line according to the outskirts of the town before moving in and gaining a foothold in separate parts, bringing control over the southern, eastern, and northern parts of it. Instead, we will see that the Russians would push to gain control over Pokrovsk, which will allow them to oversee the roads here to the south towards Konstantinivka. This will create a front line and flank of northern position and supply and support the Russian positions moving directly towards the town. It is clear with the developments of the past 24 hours from the start of the 4th of May to the end of it that the Russians really started offensive operations to the north by Ocheretine, Berdeshi, and Tonenke, the capture of Kotlyarivka in the north, offensive operations by Bakhmut towards the micro district of Chasiv Yar, and restarting operations direction of Novomikhailivka, the recent advance in Nitailove. All this indicates that the Russians are intensifying their offensive operations here in these days to move on to the next step in the front line here west of Donetsk. In the south, the Ukrainians are continuing their Krinky adventures by pushing and gaining control over a small 10-hectare area. The objective of the Ukrainians here is honestly a mystery to me. Even for PR, it doesn't really make any sense. It is simply they've lost too much to just leave it behind sort of situation, where they believe that once they end, it will be a symbolic end to any operations in the Never and Konka rivers. So this is indicative that the Ukrainians will continue with their presence here. And before you call me, oh, you're pro-Russian, you do not see the significance of Krinky, well, tell that to the thousands of soldiers that have probably lost their lives in this operation to this point for no gain at all. In comparison, the Ukrainian recapture of Nevelske is much more significant than all of the months and thousands of lives lost in the Battle of Krinky. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon for additional content, and have a great day.